Hi class, this is your instructor, Skylar Huff, and welcome to Chapter 2, our second chapter. So this is the chemistry of life. So chemistry often plays a role in fiction, particularly detective stories involving deadly poisons such as cyanide. In real life, it is sometimes difficult to tell the difference between scientific investigation and good detective work. So on a warm spring day, a week before the Kentucky Derby, biologists were called to solve a mystery that Sherlock Holmes would have enjoyed. So take some time and find out on page 34 of your textbook about that mystery. Let us begin now with atoms. So what you're tasked with is being able to describe the basic structure of an atom in terms of the three subatomic particles. So biology is the science of life, and all life, in fact, even all non-life, is made of substances. Chemistry is a study of the properties of these substances. So while it may seem tedious or unrelated to examine the chemistry in a biology text, it is essential. So organisms are chemical machines, and to understand them, we must learn a little chemistry. So, let's get to it. Any substance in the universe that has mass and occupies space is defined as matter. So all matter is composed of extremely small particles called atoms. An atom is the smallest particle into which a substance can be divided and still retain chemical properties. So the subatomic particles. Let us begin. Every atom has the same basic structure that you see in figure 2.2. If you look at figure 2.2 on page 36 at the bottom left, you will see what I see. So at the center of every atom is a small, very dense nucleus formed of two types of subatomic particles, protons and neutrons. Whizzing around the nucleus is an orbiting cloud of a third kind of subatomic particle, the electron. Neutrons have no electrical charge, whereas protons have a positive charge, and electrons have a negative one. In a typical atom, there is an orbiting electron for every proton in the nucleus. The electron's negative charge balances the proton's positive charge so that the atom is electrically neutral. An atom is typically described by the number of protons in its nucleus or by the overall mass of the atom. The term mass and weight are often used interchangeably, but they have slightly different meanings. Mass refers to the amount of a substance, whereas weight refers to the force gravity exerts on a substance. Hence, an object has the same mass whether it is on Earth or the moon, but its weight will be greater here on Earth because Earth's gravitational force is greater than the moon's. Now on to elements. So as far as elements are, I'll say that the number of protons in the nucleus of an atom is called the atomic number. For example, the atomic number of carbon is 6 because it has 6 protons. Atoms with the same atomic number have the same chemical properties and are said to belong to the same element. Formally speaking, an element is any substance that cannot be broken down into any other substance by ordinary chemical means. So neutrons are similar to protons in mass, and the number of protons and neutrons in the nucleus of an atom is called the mass number. So a carbon atom has 6 protons as well as 6 neutrons, has a mass number of 12. So I say again, a carbon atom has 6 protons and 6 neutrons and a mass number of 12. An electron's contribution to the overall mass of an atom is negligible. The atomic numbers and mass numbers of some of the most common elements is shown on Table 2.1 on page 37. So electrons determine what atoms are like. So electrons have very little mass. Of all the mass contributing to your weight, the proportion that is contributed by electrons is less than the mass of your eyelashes. Yet, electrons determine the chemical behavior of atoms because they are the parts of atoms that come close to each other in nature to interact. Almost all the volume of an atom is empty space. Protons and neutrons lie at the core of this space, while orbiting electrons are very far from the nucleus. If the nucleus of an atom were the size of an apple, the orbit of the nearest electron will be more than a mile out. So let's get to the energy carried by electrons. So the way in which electrons carry energy is what you all should be to be explained. So let's get to that explanation. Because electrons are negatively charged, they are attracted to the positively charged nucleus, but they also repel each other's negative charge. It takes work to keep them in orbit, just as it takes work to hold an apple in your hand when gravity is pulling the apple down toward the ground. The apple in your hand is said to possess energy, the ability to do work, because of its position. If you were to release it, the apple would fall. Similarly, electrons have energy of position, known as potential energy. It takes work to oppose the attraction of the nucleus, so moving the electron farther out away from the nucleus requires an input of energy and results in electron with greater potential energy. Cells use the potential energy of atoms to drive chemical reactions. So the volume of space around a nucleus where an electron is most likely to be found is called the orbital of that electron. Each energy level of an atom, called an electron shell, has a specific number of orbitals, and each orbital can hold up to 2 electrons. So the first shell in any atom contains 1 orbital. So helium, which is shown in figure 2.3a, has 1 electron shell with 1 orbital that corresponds to the lowest energy level. The orbital contains 2 electrons, shown above and below the nucleus. In atoms with more than 1 electron shell, the second shell contains 4 orbitals and holds up to 8 electrons. Nitrogen, shown in figure 2.3b, has 2 electron shells. The first one is completely filled with 2 electrons, but 3 of the 4 orbitals in the second electron shell are not filled because nitrogen's second shell contains only 5 electrons, which are openings in orbitals indicated by the dotted white circles that you can see on page 37. In atoms with more than 2 electron shells, subsequent shells also contain up to 4 orbitals with a maximum of 8 electrons. Atoms with unfilled electron orbitals tend to be more reactive because they lose, gain, or share electrons in order to fill their outermost electron shell. An atom is completely filled. An atom with a completely filled outermost shell is more stable. Let's get to now ions and isotopes. So not all atoms of an element are the same. They sometimes differ in the number of electrons or neutrons. So now you all will differentiate between a cation and an anion. Sometimes an atom may gain or lose an electron from its outer shell. Atoms in which the number of electrons does not equal the number of protons because they have gained or lost 1 or more electrons are called ions. All ions are electrically charged. For example, an atom of sodium becomes positively charged, well, it becomes a positively charged ion called a cation when it loses an electron. You can see this in figure 2.4 on page 38. One proton in the nucleus is left with an unbalanced charge. So negatively charged ions called anions form when an atom gains one or more electrons from another atom. So now you have the isotope, the cation, and the anion. So now let's get to further information about isotopes, dealing with carbon particularly. The number of neutrons in an atom of a particular element can vary without changing the chemical properties of the element. Atoms that have the same number of protons and electrons but a different number of neutrons are called isotopes. Isotopes of an atom have the same atomic number but differ in their mass number. Most elements in nature exist as mixtures of different isotopes. The most common isotope of carbon has 6 neutrons because its mass number is 12. It is referred to as carbon-12, and you can see this in figure 2.5 on page 38. The isotope carbon-14 is rare, and it is unstable, such that its nucleus tends to break up into particles with lower atomic numbers in a process called radioactive decay. Radioactive isotopes are used in dating fossils, as discussed in the inquiry and analysis at the end of this chapter, and in medicine. So medical uses of radioactive isotopes are used in many medical procedures. Short-lived isotopes, meaning those that decay fairly rapidly and produce harmless products, are commonly used as tracers, a radioactive substance that is taken up and used by the body. Emissions from the radioactive isotope tracer are detected using special lab equipment and can reveal key diagnostic information about the functioning of the body. For example, if a PET, and this is referring to a PET scan or PET-CT, which is positron emission tomography or positron computerized tomography, imaging procedures can be used to identify cancerous areas. So you see right here just how it's used. So this patient has been previously injected with the radioactive tracer that is absorbed in greater amounts by cancer cells. So the tracer emits radioactivity that is detected. So the cancerous areas or in the neck are seen as bright red glowing areas. Molecules. Molecules are collections of atoms linked together by chemical bonds. So you all will define a chemical bond and describe 3 principal kinds. A molecule is a group of atoms held together by energy. The energy acts as glue, ensuring that the various atoms stick to one another. The energy or force holding 2 atoms together is called a chemical bond. There are 3 principal kinds of chemical bonds: ionic bonds, where the force is generated by the attraction of oppositely charged ions; covalent bonds, where the force results from the sharing of electrons; and hydrogen bonds, where the force is generated by the attraction of opposite partial electric charges. So now let's explain how ionic bonds promote crystal formation. Chemical bonds called ionic bonds form when atoms are attracted to each other by opposite electrical charges. Just as the positive pole of a magnet is attracted to the negative pole of another, so an atom can form a strong link with another atom if they have opposite electrical charges. Because an atom with an electrical charge is an ion, these bonds are called ionic bonds, as you can see here in figure 2.7a. Everyday table salt is built of ionic bonds. The sodium and chlorine atoms that make up table salt are ions. The sodium gives up the sole electron in its outermost shell, and chlorine gains an electron to complete its outermost shell. As a result of this electron hopping, sodium atoms in table salt are positive sodium ions, and chlorine atoms are negative chloride ions. Because each ion is electrically attracted to all surrounding ions of opposite charge, they form an elaborate matrix of ionic bonds between alternating sodium and chloride, ions, which is a crystal. That is why table salt is composed of tiny crystals and is not a powder. So the two key properties of ionic bonds that make them form crystals are that they are strong and that they are not directional. An ion is attracted to the electrical field contributed by all nearby ions of opposite charge. Ionic bonds do not play an important role in most biological molecules because they the lack of directionality. Biological molecules require more specific associations made by directional bonds. On to the covalent bond. So you will distinguish between polar and nonpolar covalent bonds. Strong chemical bonds called covalent bonds form between two atoms when they share electrons. See figure 2.8 on page 40. Most of the atoms in your body are linked to other atoms by covalent bonds. So why do atoms and molecules share electrons? Well, if you remember, all atoms seek to fill their outermost shell of orbiting electrons, in which all atoms take 8 electrons, except hydrogen and helium, of course. So, the carbon atom has 4 electrons in its outermost shell, and so carbon can form as many as 4 covalent bonds in its attempt to fully populate the outermost shell of electrons. Because there are many ways that 4 covalent bonds can form, carbon atoms participate in different kinds of molecules. The strength of covalent bonds increases as more electrons are shared. If only one pair of electrons is shared between two atoms, the covalent bond is called a single covalent bond. If 2 pairs of electrons are shared, it is a stronger bond called a double covalent bond. And if 3 pairs are shared, it is a very strong triple covalent bond. The two key properties of covalent bonds that make them ideal for molecule building roles in living systems are: 1, they are strong, involving the sharing of lots of energy, and 2, they are very directional, allowing bonds to form between 2 specific atoms rather than creating a generalized attraction for one atom for its neighbors. Now, polar covalent bonds. When covalent bonds form between 2 atoms, one nucleus may be much better at attracting the shared electrons than the other. In water, for example, the shared electrons are more strongly attracted to the oxygen atom than the hydrogen atoms. When this happens, shared electrons spend more time in the vicinity of the oxygen atom, making it somewhat negative in charge. They spend less time in the vicinity of the hydrogens, and these become somewhat positive in charge. The charges are not full electrical charges, as in ions, but rather tiny partial charges. So what you end up with is a sort of a sort of molecular magnet with positive and negative ends, or poles. Molecules like this are said to be polar molecules. Hydrogen bonds. So here you should be able to predict which molecules will form hydrogen bonds with each other. Polar molecules, like water, are attracted to one another through a special type of weak chemical bond called a hydrogen bond. Hydrogen bonds occur when the positive end of a polar molecule is attracted to the negative end of another, like two magnets drawn to each other. In a hydrogen bond, an electropositive hydrogen from one polar molecule is attracted to an electronegative atom, often oxygen or nitrogen, from another polar molecule. Water is very polar because the oxygen atoms in water molecules are more electronegative than the hydrogen atoms. See figure 2.10 on page 41. In a water molecule, each oxygen has a partial negative charge, and each hydrogen has a partial positive charge. Hydrogen bonds form between the positive end of one polar water molecule and the negative end of another polar water molecule. Two key properties of hydrogen bonds cause them to play an important role in the molecules found in organisms. First, hydrogen bonds are highly directional. Second, they are weak, and so are not effective over long distances, like more powerful covalent or ionic bonds. Too weak to actually form stable molecules, they act more like Velcro, forming a tight bond by the additive effects of many weak interactions. Next, we'll get into what is called unique properties of water. And as we get to that, you're now seeing the hydrogen bond being between that slightly negative charge of the oxygen and that slight positive charge of those hydrogens, making water molecules stick to other water molecules. 3/4 of the Earth's surface is covered by liquid water. About 2/3 of your body is water. And you cannot exist long without water. All other organisms also require water. The chemistry of life, then, is the chemistry of water. Water's ability to form hydrogen bonds is responsible for much of the organization of living chemistry, from the structure of the membranes that encase every cell to how large molecules fold. The weak hydrogen bonds that form between a hydrogen atom of one water molecule and the oxygen atom of another produce a lattice of hydrogen bonds within liquid water. Each of these bonds is individually very weak and short-lived, that last a very short amount of time. Do you see the commas? Exactly. However, the cumulative effect of large numbers of these bonds is enormous and responsible for many of the important physical properties of water. Let's begin. Water stores heat. And it's due to the water temperature changing so slowly and holding temperature so well. So the temperature of any substance is measured by how rapidly its individual molecules are moving. Due to the many hydrogen bonds that water molecules form with one another, a large input of thermal energy is required to disrupt the organization of the liquid water and raise its temperature. Because of this, water heats up more slowly than almost any other compound and holds its temperature longer. That is the major reason why your body is mostly water and able to maintain a relatively constant internal temperature. Let's explain why ice floats. Few hydrogen bonds break at low temperatures. Water becomes less dense as it freezes because the hydrogen bonds hold water molecules farther apart. So if the temperature of water is low enough, very few hydrogen bonds between water molecules will break, and instead the lattice of these bonds assumes a crystal-like structure, forming a solid we call ice. Interestingly, ice is less dense than water. That is why icebergs and ice cubes float. Why is ice less dense? This is best understood by comparing the molecular structures of liquid water and ice, as you see in figure 2.11, figure A and figure B. At temperatures above freezing, water molecules move around each other with hydrogen bonds breaking and forming. As temperatures drop, the movement of water molecules decreases, allowing hydrogen bonds to stabilize and hold individual molecules farther apart. This stabilized lattice makes the ice structure less dense. Water also evaporates. And it's all due to water requiring a tremendous energy to vaporize because those hydrogen bonds must be broken. So when water vaporizes, it takes this heat energy with it, allowing for the evaporative cooling effect. So if the temperature of water is high enough, many hydrogen bonds between water molecules will break, with the result of that liquid being changed into vapor. So this is explaining why sweat cools you. So a considerable amount of heat energy is required to do this. So every gram of water evaporates from your skin. For every gram of water that evaporates from your skin, 2,452 joules of heat from your body, which is equal to the energy released by lowering the temperature of 586 grams of water 1 degree Celsius. That's a lot of heat. So that is why sweating cools you off. As sweat evaporates or vaporizes, it takes energy with it in the form of heat, cooling the body. So now let's get to how water clings. Let's get to now how water clings to polar molecules. Because water molecules are very polar, they are attracted to each other. And as they are attracted to other polar molecules, hydrogen bonds bind the polar molecules to each other. So when the other polar molecule is another water molecule, the attraction is called cohesion. Get it? Cohesion. The surface tension of water is created by cohesion. Surface tension is a force that causes water to bead or supports the weight of an insect. See figure 2.12 on page 43. When the other polar molecule is a different substance, the attraction is called adhesion. So water clings to any substance with it which it can form hydrogen bonds. Again, I say water clings to any substance with which it can form hydrogen bonds. So adhesion is why things get wet. No, literally, that's why things get wet when they are dipped in water. And that is also why waxy substances do not. They're composed of non-polar molecules that do not form hydrogen bonds with water molecules. And next we'll get to water being very polar. So water molecules in a solution tend to form the maximum number of hydrogen bonds possible and gather around polar molecules or molecules with an electrical charge. For example, when a salt crystal dissolves in water, what really happens is that individual ions break off from the crystal and become surrounded by water molecules. Water molecules orient around each ion and form a hydration shell, preventing the ions from reassociating with the crystal. Polar molecules that dissolve in water in this way are said to be soluble in water. I think you all have heard of this before. In contrast, when non-polar molecules are placed in water, the water molecules, they shy away. The non-polar molecules are forced into association with one another and are referred to as being hydrophobic. Polar molecules, on the other hand, are hydrophilic. So hydrophilic molecules are attracted to water and dissolved easily in it. They form hydrogen bonds. They are polar molecules. Hydrophobic molecules are repelled by water and do not dissolve. So they are nonpolar and do not form hydrogen bonds. So now let's end the chapter with what I call water and the ionization of water. So you all will predict the change in hydrogen ion concentration represented by a difference of 1 on the pH scale. So one of the most important properties of water arises from its ease with which its chemical bonds break. So ionization. Covalent bonds within water molecules sometimes break spontaneously. When it happens, a proton or hydrogen atom nucleus dissociates from the molecule as a positively charged ion, a hydrogen ion. The rest of the dissociated water molecule which has retained the shared electron from the covalent bond, is a negatively charged hydroxide ion. And this is shown before you with pH. A convenient way to express the hydrogen ion concentration of a solution is to use the pH scale. Please see figure 2.14 on page 44. The scale ranges from 0, the highest hydrogen ion concentration, to 14, the lowest hydrogen ion concentration. Pure water has a pH of 7. Each pH unit represents a tenfold change in the hydrogen ion concentration. This means that a solution with a pH of 4 has 10 times the hydrogen ion concentration of a solution with a pH of 5, and 100 times the concentration of hydrogen ions of a solution with a pH of 6. Acids. And this is the pH scale. Now let's get to acids. Any substance that dissociates in water to increase the concentration of hydrogen ions is called an acid. Acidic solutions have pH values below 7. The stronger the acid, the more hydrogen ions, so the lower its pH. So again, the stronger the acid, the more hydrogen ions, and so the lower its pH. For clarification. For example, hydrochloric acid, which is abundant in your stomach, ionizes completely in water, giving the solution a pH of 1. Bases. A substance that combines with hydrogen ions when dissolved in water is called a base. By combining with hydrogen ions, a base lowers the hydrogen ion concentration in the solution. Basic or alkaline solutions therefore have pH values above 7. Very strong bases, such as sodium hydroxide, have pH values of 12 or more. Buffers. The pH inside almost all living cells and the fluid surrounding cells in multicellular organisms is very close to 7, or fairly close to 7. The many proteins that govern metabolism are all extremely sensitive to pH, and slight alterations in pH can cause the molecules to take on different shapes and disrupt their activities. For this reason, it is important that a cell maintain a constant pH level. The pH of blood is roughly 7.35 to 7.45, and you would only survive a few minutes if it were to fall to 7 or rise to 7.8. So what keeps an organism's pH constant? Cells contain chemical substances called buffers that minimize changes in concentrations of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. And they do this by taking up or releasing hydrogen ions into a solution as the hydrogen ion concentration of a solution changes. So please be sure to review today's biology feature, Acid Rain, as it explains when acid rain or snow exceeds the buffering capacity of a tree or another organism. Death may result. So this has been Chapter 2. Please be sure to put the concept in the chapter to work here, meaning by putting the chapter to work on page 46, and also retrace the learning path with some simple chemistry, and then water, the cradle of life. You find that on page 46 as well, not to mention the inquiry and analysis. This has been your instructor, Skylar Huff, and I thank you all for listening. Prepare well for your test.